I had a gentleman come in. So I take him through the program. He absolutely loves it. And he said, would you be willing to speak to my wife? He says, I sat in a mediation across from her and couldn't remember why I was divorcing her. He says, I thought I hated her. I didn't hate her. I loved her. But all my trauma had such an impact on me, I was taking it out on her. And I created all this anger and frustration. He goes, and I realized I loved this woman. I couldn't come up with a reason why I was divorcing her. And then I had another one that's really interesting, which is the reversal of that. She had a lot of trauma, but then she ended up wanting a divorce. She realized that she didn't marry me because she loved me. She married me because I was secure, and she never had security and safety. So he became her safe place, but she wasn't in love with him.
I'm looking forward to you sharing with our audience, who you are, because the human behind what you do is really important, and also what you do, because you're changing the lives of so many people. And I just think it's good for the audience to know that I chose to go through your transformative program. And I'll explain why after we get a little bit of detail of exactly what you're doing and how you're doing it. So Don, if you don't mind, share with the audience what is TIP, and what are you doing that's so game changing and different in the industry right now?
Well, TIP was really developed in order to understand what trauma is doing to our systems. And the genesis of the whole Inspired Performance program was my daughter. My daughter had 2 autoimmune disorders, and they told us she had Crohn's. And when she got Crohn's at 13, they said there's no cure for it. We don't know what causes it. She has to manage this for the rest of her life. And then she ended up with a second autoimmune called idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, which is basically where the lungs start filling up with blood. And they said, again, no cure for it. We don't know what causes it. She should live close to a hospital because her lungs could fill up in 15 minutes. So that was the thing that started. My wife said to me, you need to figure this out or we're going to lose our daughter. Right? At first she said, this must be your fault, right? Because we don't have this on my side of the family. This must be a genetic thing, because I was adopted, so we didn't have my genetic history. So I went out and started researching it. And the good news is we found a solution to it. The bad news is we didn't know that my daughter had dealt with trauma between the ages of 6 and 8, some sexual abuse that she never disclosed to us. So that was devastating to us, especially to my wife, who had also dealt with that as a child. She thought she could protect our children. And I believe sexual abuse is the #1 pandemic in the world. It's everywhere. And we're just not talking about it, because anybody who's had abuse don't want to say, like our daughter, she's in a very loving, nurturing home and still couldn't talk about it to us. So through the research, what I discovered is this unresolved trauma that keeps running. And so that's going to create inflammation, because the response to trauma, whether it's physical or emotional, is inflammation. And so the genes that regulate inflammation upregulate. The genes that regulate the immune system downregulate. And the purpose of that is a reallocation of resources. So if we're in a danger situation, a fight or flight or threatening situation, our system is protecting us. So it goes into a survival mode, and inflammation is the way it does it. It protects the system. But it's not supposed to stay in that. When you get out of danger, the inflammation comes down, the immune system comes up. What I discovered is this trauma keeps running in the background and keeps the system in that state. So that's the perfect recipe for disease. Inflammation high, immune low. And so that's what happened to my daughter. So she ended up with these 2 autoimmune disorders because her system was out of balance. And then the best part about this, what I'm the most excited about, is that was always my theory, but there was never any evidence of it. So I've put together a study, and I just published a study last week that shows we can change it. And so once people go through the program, we reset the system. We resolve the trauma is resolved, inflammation comes down, immune system comes up. So I published a study showing that we're getting 50% at times reduction in inflammation and 100% increase in immune system. And that's game changers. and that's a world-changing study. So we're really super excited to put that out there and show we can heal. And as you know, we're both faith-based, right? We believe that our minds and bodies are designed to heal. God designed us to heal. And so we just need to know how to get the system back into a healing state.
That's great. And for the audience, just as you listen here, Don and I are having a conversation over lunch out in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're at a Genius Network event, and we just happened to sit next to each other maybe twice in the same day. And he shares a story with me, and I start to think after I leave Don, I felt like I was healed. I felt like I had gone through trauma as a child that was related to witnessing a sexual assault, having a break in, and if you've listened to the show, you know the story. But it was quite challenging as a child. Looking back on it, I kind of coached myself out, and I felt really good. But I always had these high levels of inflammation. I always had, I had battled with ulcerative colitis, and I had been diagnosed with Crohn's, and then I had beat it, as I say. I'm using air quotes for the listeners. I had beat it, and I beat it by managing my stress, by starting to take my days slow, by altering certain things. But I started to wonder if there wasn't a better way. If maybe what Dr. Don was talking about, maybe if I went through his program, I could do more and help myself further. And I think that's exactly why I called and I went through the process. I went down to Orlando. It was an amazing process. And I highly recommend it. I've referred a lot of people to Dr. Don and will continue to do so because he's not just talking about it, he's actually executing upon it. And so the study that you just released, now what is the goal of the study? So this validates what you've been doing, what you've been executing. What do you do with this study now that you've released it? How does it take off from here?
Well, we're continuing to grow it. So this was the first test that we had done, and we give examples. We don't disclose anybody who it is, but we're showing the numbers. And so, for example, we had a 45-year-old male, very healthy guy, eats right, exercises, tells me he has no trauma, right? And so it was like, I don't know how I'm going to help, but let's do it. And so we take him through the program, a 52.6% reduction in inflammation that he doesn't know he has. And in fact, he had the Aura Ring on, and he says, my Aura Ring tells me I'm stressed. He says, but I don't feel like I'm stressed. He says, so either I don't know what stress is or the Aura Ring is wrong. 2 hours into the process, and this is what I talk about, the reason why the program I do works is I get the mind into optimal condition to heal. So 2 hours in, he says to me, he says, what are you doing? My Aura Rings tell me I'm in restore state now. He goes, we haven't talked about trauma. And I said, no, we're getting the mind ready and optimal condition to start working on the trauma. So the results were that 52.6 reduction in inflammation, 113% increase in naive CD4 T cells, and 123% in regulatory T cells. Amazing. Just by
Wow.
working on a few things that had been, there wouldn't be the big T trauma from childhood, but he did have some events that were causing that. He has no idea that that's happening. It's amazing. So we're adding to the study. So more and more people are going through. We're going to keep adding to the study.
It's amazing. It's funny when I think about it. I was doing some research for this conversation, and I was just thinking about what drove me to have the conversation with you. And it's interesting because I didn't know if it was going to make an impact, but everything that I do is to become a better husband and a better father and a better leader. And I just thought to myself, if there's something that I'm withholding from myself that I could be doing to make myself more connected with my family, more connected with my spouse. These are the things that we live for. When we leave this earth, these are the things that are the most important things to us, the people we love. And I think that's the game changing. I mean, I was talking to you prior to the show, and I just said you're doing something on Beyond Connection, unlocking the secrets to lasting relationships. This is one of the biggest challenges that some of the most successful people that I know have is successful relationships. And it's not just with their spouse or partner, it could be just with their children, with their family. This is life changing. And if you do what you're teaching, it could really make a difference.
I've got some great examples. I had a gentleman come in, very, very successful guy, media guy, and he said to me, he said, "I'm going through a very nasty divorce." He says, "We're gonna be going into mediation." He says, "But I also love your performance part of it. I wanna perform better, so I'm really coming to you for performance, but I'm also so stressed out about this, divorce and the mediation I'm going through." So I take him through the program. He absolutely loves it. And he said even the people, like, on the shows that he was on were saying, "You're so much calmer. Like, you just nailed that interview. It was really good." So he says, "From that side of it, it really helped me." And then he called me, the day before. He says, "I got the mediation tomorrow. Got any ideas, any thoughts for me before I go through it?" And I said, "Just do the tools that we taught you, right? And you'll be fine." He calls me the next day and he said, "Would you be willing to speak to my wife?" And I said, "Sure." I said, "What's up?" He says, "I sat in the mediation across from her and couldn't remember why I was divorcing her." He says, "I thought I hated her. I didn't hate her. I loved her. But all my trauma had such an impact on me, I was taking it out on her, and I created all this anger and frustration." He goes, "And I realized I love this woman. I couldn't come up with a reason why I was divorcing her." And so they're back together. And that
So
was from the worst mediation and divorce that he told me how bad it's gonna be, to literally realizing he had no anger, no hatred in his heart. And then I had another one that's really interesting, which is the reversal of that, on a positive though. So she had a lot of trauma. The husband knew about what I did, loved it, said, "I'm going to send my wife in. I know she's got a lot of trauma." It definitely improved their relationship. And so he was very happy about that. But then she ended up wanting a divorce. And what he said to me is, he says, "She realized that she didn't marry me because she loved me. She married me because I was secure, and she never had security and safety. So he became her safe place, but she wasn't in love with him." And so they ended up divorcing. He's now married to his or getting married to his college sweetheart, right? And they have a great relationship. So it turned out really positive, but the relationship wasn't what she was really looking for.
it's so interesting. I mean, it's amazing how trauma impacts so many levels of your life, whether it's the anxiety you feel in work, whether it's, where you say you're not sabotaging, but a lot of people will say they're self-sabotaging themselves in the careers. Every time they get a chance to go to the next level, they tend to blow it up. And I know you work with a lot of professionals in sports and major performers, and you find that working with them in on these things can help them break through, right? Because that's a really big challenge. They kind of hit that wall and it's almost like they need something to help them break through. And just working through this diagnostic is something that will guide them when they hit those moments.
It's amazing. So on the psychological side, it's a obvious one. So I work with professional athletes. If they're dealing with, a trauma from earlier in their life, it will have an effect. It could be a trauma from their sport, so they could have. I had one guy who's a runner, he's an Olympic runner, and he tore his knee up on a turn. And then what he said was, is they're timing him, and every time he gets to one of those turns, he pulls back a little bit and didn't know why, right? But because his mind was looping through, this is where we get hurt, and was seeing it in real time. And so once you get that out of the way, it makes a major impact. But the other area that I talk about is that it actually affects the mitochondria, the energy in the cell, and people aren't aware of that. So I've got all kinds of examples of people, as long as the trauma loop is running, it's pulling power, and that power is going to affect performance. So after people have gone through the program, they start making personal bests and don't know why. So one that's a really interesting one is a gentleman, Marco Cisetto. And Marco was a double amputee. He lost both his legs to a suicide attempt, and he was a marathon runner from Kenya. So they built him prosthetics to walk on and blades to run on again. But they called me up and said he's plateaued. He's not improving no matter how much work we're doing with him. Like it seems to he's hit a peak level. Can you take him through the process and see if you can improve his times? So Marco came in to see me. 9 days later, runs in a marathon and takes 15 seconds per mile off his time.
Wow.
And then a month later, runs in the Boston Marathon and breaks the world record for marathoners with amputations. And then 2 months later, runs in the Chicago Marathon, breaks his own world record by another 5 minutes, and gets signed by Nike. And what I said to him, I said, Marco, I didn't make you faster. You were always that fast. You didn't have access to that power. And so I worked with a group that worked with professional athletes, and I took them through the sort of program showing them how this can improve performance. And the one guy said to me, he goes, you just blew my mind. He says, we work with these professional world top athletes and never understood why they would go into a sympathetic nervous system response when they were at rest because they're monitoring them constantly. He says, you're telling me that's the trauma loop? I said, yeah. He goes, we never understood that. It made no sense to us why their system would go into that active sympathetic response when they're doing nothing. Now they got it. So these are the best in the world at their sport and are still dealing with it. Imagine what happens when you eliminate that stress response.
It's a release, huh? It's literally like a release of that negative energy that's just continuously holding you back. Uh,
And even
it's
high performers, the best in the world, still have another gear. And so all you have to do is help them get to that next gear. And again, I never take the credit for them being better athletes. I just say, I just helped you access what you didn't have access to, but you've always had it within you. So I'm not making them faster. I'm making their potential right there so that they can reach their potential.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And with athletes, it's no different than people in work and high performers. They we see it all the time in leadership. I can't tell you how many performance reviews I've done where part of it is, I see this amazing talent. I see this human that has so much potential, and I know and believe in you, but I can't believe in you enough for you to achieve these things. You have to achieve these things. And that you could see them struggling with those with that very flip of a conversation where they're like, I just don't know what I need to be doing. And we know what they need to do. There's probably just something that they have to release. There's something that they need to work through to help them really accomplish that next level.
And those emotional concussions that we talked about earlier can sometimes do that. And in the book I wrote, here are 10 things that successful people don't do, as opposed to saying, here's what successful people do. Why are you procrastinating? So I had a lady come in, very successful entrepreneur, doing really well, but she says, well, I procrastinate all the time. And so she says, I just feel like I work better under pressure. And I said, no, you don't. Nobody does. Right. And so she said, but I don't know where the procrastination came from. And so when we look back, her mother was the principal at the school she went to. And she explained to me, she says, I remember when I was doing my homework, my mother would have me come into her office. She would look at my homework. She says, I remember that red pen. She'd take out this red pen and start underlining all my mistakes. And so as we look through it, is her mind didn't want to be criticized. So the longer if her mother got really busy, she didn't have time to do it. So if she could push it off, she avoided the hurt. Her mother wasn't trying to hurt her, but she was taking it, I'm not measuring up to what my mother wants. I'm getting too many things wrong. And so because she was her own boss, right, she could push things off the last minute. Nobody could then override her or tell her what she did wrong.
How do you find things like ADHD, ADD, and these other things that we seem to a lot of high performers seem to have propensity to. What is the correlation to trauma with those things? Do you have any level of connectivity there?
Oh, totally. I got a whole different approach to ADHD. So when people say, "Oh, I have ADHD," I go, "No, you don't." Right? I said, "Did you grow up in a home with a lot of stress?" And they'll all say yes, right? Whether it's intentional or not, could be just two professional parents that are stressed out about their careers. So they're not intentionally coming, but there's a lot of tension in the home. I says, "So you and I, Scott, as adults, if we get into a disagreement, you can fight with me or you can walk away. You have fight or flight options. A child has neither in a home. They can't fight, they can't run. So how do they protect themselves from the stress? They do this. They cover up, they tune it out so they don't have to focus on what they don't like. So now during the most formative brain development years between 0 and 7, they're training their brain to tune out what they don't like. And so when you meet these high performers, especially who say they have ADHD, and there's one Genius Network member I'll say that did that as well. He said to me, "Oh, I have ADHD." And I said, "No, you don't." He goes, "No, I really do. I was diagnosed with it." And I said, "You just did a 2-hour presentation and it was so good, so comprehensive." He goes, "Yeah, but I like marketing." I said, "Yes, you like marketing so you can focus. You trained your brain to tune out what you don't like, and you call that ADHD. You don't turn it on and turn it off. It's the way your mind has trained itself. And look at all these guys who say, I have ADHD and they're successful, but they're phenomenal at what they love. And
It
that's why.
it's true. I mean, I'm hyper focused when I really, really love something. And if I don't, I am not interested at all. And it is easy to tune out. And so, I can attest to that. I also have some family members that I've gotten really good at managing and working with on a regular basis. They're very ADD and have that like energy, that high level energy. And what I found is that it's very important to just acknowledge what's important in the moment, but then bring ourselves back to what we were talking about a second ago, or bring ourselves like there's a strategy that I learned from a child's perspective how to do because of how which is so effective now in dealing with I do a lot of M&A work and mergers and acquisitions in my day job in my business, and it is one of the most emotional times for people when they sell their business. They all the past trauma and challenges of their careers and their lives come up in one moment. It's almost like a death of some sort because they're burying their entire career in their brains, and it's so emotional. And so we have to constantly bring them back to the reason they're doing it, who they're doing it for, why they're doing this at a higher level, not just the business or the money, but what's the benefit? Who's winning in this? And it's so dramatically challenging at times, but it's having worked with I won't use the ADD mind with you on the line now. I'll go to just the selective memory that they're working with, the selective attention span that they're working with, right?
It was a coping mechanism as a child. It was never anything wrong with them. They were fine, but they had developed a very good skill at blocking out what was hurting them. And then we take that child, we stick him into a school, and we say, now you got to focus on this teacher at the front of the class, and they're not interested. And then they diagnose them and they say, oh, they got ADHD. The solution to ADHD is to put them on speed. Anybody can focus on speed.
Right.
I don't care what. So then they get them on this medication, which makes them focus on what they're not interested in, as opposed to retraining their brain or finding out what they love and move them in the direction of what they're passionate about, and they'll excel. And so, but we label them and then they get stuck with this and they feel like there's something wrong with them. And I believe that that's an unfair thing to do to, especially to children, when all they have to do is just learn how to focus. Jim Quick is a great example. If you read Jim Quick's book and read his and heard his story, is he never could focus. He thought there was something wrong with him. He had a broken brain. And then in college, his friend says, "You need to meet my dad." And he meets his dad, and his dad says to him, "Well, before you quit college," because Jim was going to quit, "before you quit, I want you to read these 5 books." Because he asked Jim, "What are you interested in?" And Jim wrote down a whole bunch of stuff. And the father started reading it. And Jim says, "I was horrified. I didn't want him to read it. I just thought he asked me to write it down." And so he brings out 5 books, says to Jim, "Read the 5 books before you quit." And and his mind is saying, like, "I don't think this guy heard me. I can't read 1 book, and you're asking me to read 5 books." He says, "And then I started reading the first book, and before I knew it, I was like halfway through it." And he realized, I like this subject. They had never challenged him in school with what he liked, but he could read X-Men comics all day long. So that wasn't ADHD. That was the ability to focus on what he loved.
Yeah, Jim's an amazing man. When he was at Genius, he's also the one I talk about a lot because he talks about the introvert and the extrovert and the number of chips that they have. And the introvert starts the day with 5 chips and they hand them out slowly and then they're done for the day. While the extrovert builds upon those chips as the day goes on and then they crash at the end. And I always found that to be challenging in school for me. And that is being an extrovert, being in a room full of people and energy. I'm an energy person, so it was always difficult for me to just sit when all that energy was in the room, all those people to talk to, all those people to connect with. Like, I remember I got traded between we in Catholic school, we used to have the A group and the B group. The A group were the smart kids, the B group took longer to learn. And I would start out in the B group, then I'd get traded to the A group, then I would talk too much and they'd move me to the B group again. I
You're
mean,
distracting the A's.
exactly. I mean, the A group wanted me in their group, the B group wanted me in their group, and I was like, I didn't belong in either of them. And it was only because I had a level of energy that needed to be addressed, and I wasn't getting that connectivity. I wasn't getting that creativity. It was more about sitting and organizing. And I learned years later that I do much better work in an audience. So if I surround myself with people and we build something, my best ideas come out. But if I sit in an office by myself, I do not do well. And I get bored, I get annoyed, I get frustrated. So it's learning that stuff about yourself though that helps you overcome and conquer getting to the next level because you realize that it's not a problem. It's actually a superpower if used the right way.
100%. But they don't recognize that in typical schools because they've got 30 kids in a class. They can't recognize individual skills. So they keep everybody in a cookie cutter mentality. But you weren't a cookie cutter type of person, right? But once you got out on your own, you could discover that. But it doesn't promote it in schools.
No, it really doesn't. And I think what I love about what you're doing is I think that this release, that this connectivity that you're able to create with people to themselves allows them to be a better version of themselves and then it allows them to be so much more connected to their partners, to their families. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I know that say they don't talk to their parents anymore. They don't talk to their aunt and uncle that they loved and grew up with or their cousins because they disagree about one thing. I mean, think of politics right now. I mean, and how disconnected people are when it's really something that's internal. It's our own insecurities, our own challenges, our own, you know, emotional concussions holding us
Yeah.
back.
Yep. And people take it personally, right? Everybody has an opinion on something. You can respect another opinion without having to disconnect from that person, right? If we were all the same, it would be pretty boring, right? So you really want to say, how many friends do you have? You want to have a different collection of friends. But I have really good friends of ours, some of our best friends, my wife and I, they lost a relationship because the wife of the other couple was so anti on Trump that as soon the guy just had a MAGA hat on and a picture she saw on online and disconnected them completely as a couple. And she didn't really even she never talked about it. They never even talked about politics when they were together, right? But as soon as she saw him in a MAGA hat, she was just like, I can't be friends with that person. I mean, that's hard.
It's awful, and if you think about it, Don, think about this. How many times are people it right now, you know the human, you've grown up with the human, you've been best friends with them for 30 something years. You just because you believe someone stands for something that they agree with more politically, you're willing to throw a 30-year relationship down the drain. It makes no sense to me whatsoever, and it's happening all the time. I had a conversation this past week. I was in Tampa meeting with a couple of friends, and we both see the world a little differently. And they're more academics, and they've been in the academia world, and there's an ideology and a thought process that they've been surrounded by. And I'm in the business world, and so I understand the concept of breaking it and rebuilding it. Like, that's, if I come into your business, I've got to come in and just kind of figure out all the things that are working and all the things that aren't, and I want to kind of rebuild it. And we had a conversation, and it was a awesome conversation because we all respect each other. And I at one point in time I said, "Guys, okay, so you believe that the world is going to really just come to an end, and you've got to get rid of all your investments, and you need to throw all these things out the window. What if you're not right? What if you're just not right? Have you ever thought that you could be wrong?" I said, "I want you to understand. Take me, for example. In 2016, I started a brand new business, one that I was willing to invest in, and I didn't know who the president was going to be. In fact, Hillary Clinton was supposed to win that election enormously, and it didn't matter because I don't care who's winning. That is not impacting my decisions, my work, who I'm helping, how I'm helping them. And if we let these things take over us, we forget the very importance of politics is meant to be politics. It could be separate from us, but our human relationships, I'd rather be friends with someone that differs from me and learn from them than actually focus on what makes us different all the time.
I think the key in that is the respect part. Is if they're respectful of my opinion and I'm respectful of their opinion, we'll get along fine. It's when it gets into disrespect. And I learned that my dad always said that to me. He goes, "You can disagree with me at any time with whatever I say, as long as you're respectful." And so we could present our argument, and if we were respectful, he'd listen. It doesn't mean he's going to agree with us, but at the same time, he would listen and he wouldn't accept disrespect. He goes, "That's where the conversation ends." So if you have friends who, they're a Democrat, you're a Republican, or vice versa, and you can respect their opinion and why they believe in that, right? You get along fine. And so this couple I was talking about, they're actually both the couple, one's Republican, one's Democrat, and they get along fine, and we get along fine with them because we're respectful. And I'm always willing to listen to the other side. But if you grew up with that, and that my dad, promoted that even in our own family, right? That's how you're trained. But if you grew up, and again, these come down to these emotional concussions, right? If you had parents that basically said, you cut off anybody who tries to oppose you, right? And they start talking about they hate this person and hate that person, you're going to grow up with that hate.
Yeah, I made the comment when President Trump was shot. I had some friends that um, were were maybe celebrating on social media and different things, and I didn't criticize. I didn't stop following them because I didn't agree or disagree. But I did tell one of them, I said, if you ever find yourself on the side of hate, you're probably on the wrong side of the argument. Meaning that if you're not open-minded enough to understand that there's probably more to this than you understand, you know you're closing down. And if hate is what we're leading with, because whether you agreed or disagreed with the former president, whether you agreed or disagreed with anybody, I mean a family member, if you don't actually empathize with where they've come from, who they are, what their story is, we don't know those things. And politicians, we think we know because the news tells us or because it's reported in the Times or the Wall Street Journal, but we only know what's being told to us. We don't know them and the whole story. And so I my comeback is always, if we find ourselves on the side of hate, I don't care which side you're on, you probably are on the wrong side of the argument.
100%. I agree with that. And again, it's coming down to what I talk about all the time is the atmospheric conditions, which we talk about with Joe all the time at Genius Network. If you understood the atmospheric conditions of a person's life, what they grew up with, you'd understand why they do and why they believe what they believe. And so that's where the respect comes in. I can understand if that's how they were raised and that's what they were, indoctrinated with, whether we agree with it or not, that's what they believe. And so I always use it as if you grew up and everything that you learned in math class was the same as me, except one calculation that 1 + 1 = 3. So let's just say I grew up and I was taught that. We will never agree on a calculation if 1 + 1 comes into the calculation. And I'll guarantee that I'm right. And you'll never convince me I'm not right because that's how I grew up and that's what I learned. And so how can you blame me for that? You know I'm wrong. It's I don't know I'm wrong, right? Because that's what I learned. But it doesn't mean you have to hate me. You can just understand I couldn't be any different if that's the knowledge I got.
It's also a lose-lose. It's sorta like watching your best friend's, spouse cheat on them and then being the person to go tell them. You're never gonna win in that scenario. It's an awful place to be. You don't wanna point out somebody's, being wrong. You want to actually try to be curious. I think your dad had it right, because when I think about the moments that frustrate me most as a father, it's when, a mistake is made, and instead of either being curious or apologetic, there's a defensiveness of why the decision was right. And those are the challenges that you get into. It's like, hey, be curious, ask extra questions, let's figure it out together, or just be apologetic because you don't understand the whole story, but just I apologize. I probably should have thought of something different. It's my bad. That's the error on the side of curiosity is always a good thing.
And if you're not open to listen to other things and other experiences, you're never going to learn. So I'm a big believer. In fact, it's really interesting. I've got a young lady that works with us and she's Palestinian. And so I said to her, I said, I want to sit down with you and really hear where you're coming from. I'd love to know where your perspective is. And she's easy to get along with. I know we would never argue about it. There'd never be any disagreement. I'm fascinated to hear what she thinks about what's going on.
Right.
Because I know I said I could learn so much about what's happening from your perspective. That's going to help me have, a different perspective or reinforce my perspectives.
Right. And especially when again, when it's open-mindedness and curiosity versus hatred. If I'm arguing a point and my argument is you should die if you're not X, then it's very difficult for me to listen to your perspective. But if your perspective is I understand that there are two sides to this argument and I don't really understand all the complexities around it. Let me try to become curious and understand why or why not it's important to you or me. And it is a talent though, and I think it's also a growth. I mean, if you think about it, going back to the gentleman that you said went into mediation, I imagine part of what changed that entire scenario was the calm and composure that his wife saw in that meeting that she had not seen in years. And when you're calm and composed, it's hard. Why is it why is it that we that tend to have had maybe the big T's or even lots of little T's? Why is it that we tend to create chaos where chaos doesn't exist? What is the reason?
Because if we got hurt in a situation, so our mind is trying to protect us from being hurt. And so what it's going to do is it's going to put you into an attack mode to protect yourself. So the purpose of that emotion of anger is to fight. The purpose of fear is to run. So if you get angry when you are in a situation, chances are you got hurt and your mind is now looping through how I got hurt and how's it going to respond to this current situation. I got to fight because I didn't fight before. And so now I got to fight this time. So a good example, I had a gentleman who had panic attacks for years, a lot of tremendous childhood trauma. And he went through the program, got rid of his panic attacks. And he said, he called me up because he's got to share something with you. Because he said, my son's upstairs. He can't find his headphones. He's upstairs screaming and yelling, getting really mad. He says, I go up the stairs. He says, I help him find his headphones. He says, I come back downstairs and my wife's in the kitchen. And as I walk in the kitchen, she gets up and comes over and hugs me. And he goes, well, that's nice. Why are you hugging me? She says, because of the way you handled that. And he says, what do you mean? She says, when I heard him yelling and I heard your footsteps going up the stairs, she says, I sat here bracing for the battle. I knew it was going to be a knockdown screaming match. And she says, and he's yelling, and you're like, have you looked over here? Why don't we check over here? She says, you handle that completely different than you did before because he wasn't filtering through his pain anymore. He could stay in the present and help his son. He couldn't have done that, not because he's a bad father, but because his mind was using his old atmospheric conditions to teach him how to handle a threat now. But it was faulty intelligence.
That's powerful. You're also utilizing this to help with addiction. I mean, you've shared some stories in the past with me of some people that have come to you with major addictions, and obviously addiction is just pain, right? And it's this challenging moment where you're trying to subsidize that, you're trying to push down the pain so you feel it a little less. So having the drink or taking the shot or using the drug is numbing you from whatever it is that you're feeling. How are you working with addicts to help them today?
Completely different approach. I take the approach of addiction is not a disease. Addiction is a code. Your brain is a computer. So if every time you feel pain when you have this memory coming back, so something happened to you in your life, you feel this pain, you take the drink or take the drug, you stop the pain. So your subconscious mind, your survival brain is literal. It sees everything as now. So when does it want the pain to stop? Now. Your subconscious has no connection to time. So everything is now. So the drink or the drug solves the problem. It's the solution to the problem. Because it has no connection to time, it can't see consequences. So it's only your conscious logical mind that can see, oh, if I do this, I'm going to create a problem. But your subconscious mind is literal. It says, that's the problem. Here's the solution. Took care of that problem. And it can't see a consequence to it. And then the more you repeat it, you're building a bigger and bigger code that the brain just uses as its resource. And so a lot of people, and then we shame and guilt them, when in actual fact, it's just their system that's protecting them, not hurting them. So I take that shame and guilt out of it. I said, if I'd experienced your pain, I would have found a resource too. I never had their pain. I've never touched a drug, never had alcohol in my life ever once, but I never experienced their pain. So I had a young lady in here for the last 2 weeks. She went through the whole program, just amazing transformation in what she's doing. And so I said to her, as she's leaving, I said, so now somebody says to you, oh, you're an addict. I said, what's the response? This is a response we showed her. She says, now I experienced the symptoms of addiction. However, I've recovered. I'm not in recovery, I recovered. I know AA and NA have the intent is to help people, and they do. But I don't believe in the model of you're broken and defeated and you have to white knuckle this for the rest of your life. So the example I gave her is I said, did you get COVID? She goes, yes. She says, I had COVID. I said, so you have COVID? She goes, I had COVID. I said, right, you had COVID. Do you still have COVID? She goes, no. I said, you recovered from COVID. You had symptoms of COVID. Your system defeated the symptoms. You're now back into homeostasis and balance. Same thing with addiction. And that removes all that shame and guilt. I said, don't stick with that. We're designed to heal.
And the shame and guilt really is what also ends up pushing you right back down into probably rediscovering what had you there in the first place. I mean, when you start to relive those moments or you start to feel that shame and guilt, it can push you in that cycle of negativity.
Yep. And it's like, well, I'm an addict, so I guess I may as well give into it again. And I just say, no, you don't have to. So I don't know if you saw the show, the NBC show that we were just on, the Today Show.
I didn't see the Today Show. I saw the excerpt that was posted, but I didn't see the whole thing.
Oh, okay. So they interviewed one lady who went through our program, 17 years in addiction. And she's been 6 years absolutely clean, no problem. Got her daughter back, reconciled with her family, has two businesses. She's married now. I mean, totally changed her life. And she says, what Dr. Wood did was change my whole outlook on addiction. And so she beat it. And she's no longer an addict. And she doesn't treat herself like an addict. And so she shared her story, and what it did is and same thing with this young girl that just came in. I said, I want you to understand what addiction is. And when you understand it, you'll see why I'm saying what I'm saying. And I had one guy who went through the program. He said, the difference between what you do and what rehab does. He says, I'd get out of rehab and I couldn't stop thinking about wanting to use. I got out of your program. I don't think about it anymore. It's not on his mind all the time. And so all the shame and guilt that people put on him were not helping him. They were hurting him and holding him back from reaching his potential. And so now he doesn't have any of those issues. She doesn't. So it's a whole different approach to it. And the idea that people are trying to get high, they're addicted, so they're going out to get high. So they want this dopamine hit. They want to feel good. So that's why they're doing it. So the way I explain it is if you and I were standing together, Scott, and I was shaking your hand and I squeezed it so hard that you were in so much pain, and then I hand you a drink and I say, if you take a drink of this, I'm going to let go. So you take a drink because you're in so much pain, and I let go. What are you going to get?
Relief.
Dopamine hit.
Yeah.
You're going to feel good. But is that why you took the drink? No. You wanted to stop the pain. But they're going to make you sound like you took it because you wanted to feel good and you wanted to get high. Pain is the greatest motivator to make something happen. And as I was developing the program and researching, research kept falling in my lap. It just felt like I was supposed to go this way. Here's some more research. And this is sort of a different kind of thing to explain, but I found an article from a World War II German sniper who said, when we fought against the Russians didn't have a lot of weapons, but they had a lot of people. So their strategy was whatever weapons they had, they charged at the German lines. The German army would shoot them, and then somebody else would run out and pick up the weapon and keep charging. And he says, so it's wave after wave after wave. And he says, and then eventually they get into the bunkers and try to overrun us with people. He says, but then I figured out how to stop them. He says, I didn't kill them. He says, I shot them in the stomach, which is the most painful place to be shot. So now all these Russians are lying on the field screaming in agony. The next Russian didn't want to run out and pick up the weapon. That was a bigger motivator. Death was more acceptable than pain.
Mm.
That's how powerful pain is.
Wow.
I learned so much from that article. It was incredible.
That is incredible. And I think when you're open and curious and looking for answers and you're working towards something, it's amazing how things will fall into place. I mean, I think it's amazing how you meet the right people at the right times or you connect it. You know, there's so many times in my life where I don't know what the next step is or I don't know how to get there. But you know, we always talk in our Genius Network about who, not how, right? And all of a sudden you end up with the right who's and you're having the right conversation. And it's amazing to me how that tends to work, and that's the universe just pulling everything together.
I think it was the same thing for me in figuring out the program and how I developed it. And somebody said one of the Genius Network members' sister, who's in research, she came in to meet me because she wanted to hear about the study we're doing because that's actually what she does. And she says, you created a formula, right, to do this. Like, how did you do that? And I said, because I've always been an entrepreneur, but I came into this to save my daughter. So I saw what they missed, and they couldn't see it because they were trained one way. And so the people that were treating my daughter's Crohn's were trained in intestinal issues. They never connected it up to the psychology. They connected it only to the intestinal issues, so they kept cutting out pieces of her intestines because that's the only thing they could do because the cells were dying. And what I said is the Crohn's was the symptom of the problem. It wasn't the problem. And that's what I say about addiction. Addiction's the symptom of a problem, but they focus on the symptom, which is addiction. You'll never fix the problem if you're always focused on the symptom.
Yeah, it's my hope that our medical world starts to move in a unique direction and starts to think outside the box, because I think it's really important that we start to look deeper and not at only the symptoms, but the actual problems. And it's very challenging, but I think it's something that could really change. And I think you're a pioneer at helping the world of trauma, helping people really get through some of the toughest moments of their lives, and sometimes they don't even know what's holding them back. I mean, I've dealt with people in my work environment, Don, where they're screamers and yellers. That when things don't go their way, they just absolutely burst at anybody. And I have to keep the culture up, and I have to call my team, and I have to tell them, we can work through it. And then I have to have a conversation about respect and help them understand it. And they teeter between narcissism and anger and frustration, and deep down, what is they're just still fight or flight at all times, and they can't function, and they need to be healed.
That's why this needs to get out to corporate America, because when you take it to corporate America, you can change the culture inside a corporation because you don't know what they're bringing into work. And they've been pretty good at trying to cover it up. So they get to an interview, but you don't know that they had such severe abuse by an authority figure in their life. And now you're their new boss. And if they hear something you say that sounds like what they had experienced as a child, and all of a sudden they're just ignoring you, or they're yelling at you, or they're quitting. And you go, but I don't get it. I thought I was fine. I thought we had a good relationship, and you should. But they're filtering through their atmospheric conditions, which is creating their mind to produce the thoughts they produce.
How do you do that in corporate America, Don? For those people that are listening, how would you change the recipe, and what would it be to help these corporations or even small businesses cope with some of these challenges?
Is really to take them through it in groups. So the good thing about it is we can do this in large groups. So the strategy we're looking at for corporate America is to come in and do C-level people, maybe in a smaller group or even one-on-ones. And then we have our online version, and then the whole company gets the online version, and then you communicate amongst all of them, right? And then do bigger groups or do, monthly webinars that they can come in and ask questions and learn more. But if you could heal your staff and you don't have to do anything, just let them go through the program, they'll heal themselves. And that's how the lady from NBC that did the story, she was recommended to do the online program by another CNN reporter who had said to her, I went through this program and it was really amazing. And so she did, and she went through the program. And what she said was, at first, she didn't know what she was experiencing. It felt different. And she says, and then a couple days later, she called back her friend from CNN and said, I just figured it out. She says, I was in my boss's office talking to my boss. And she says, and I realized I'm not anxious. She says, I'm always anxious around my boss. But once she cleared that up, she didn't know what felt different. It just felt different. And she goes, I spent years in therapy trying to get rid of my anxiety and nothing had worked. And yet she says, I still can't wrap my head around how you did this in 4 hours. And that's why they did this story.
That's amazing. Talk to me about the what you call the the trauma concussions, or you say that they're
Emotional
emotional
concussion.
concussions. Yeah, explain that to the listeners because I feel like that's so interesting because a lot of people don't have the big T, the big huge trauma. And our generation, and I'd like to say this very clearly, I think that there is a line in the sand of where everybody likes to talk about, you know, trauma nowadays, and there's a generation of like Gen X and forward that I think just ignored it all and moved forward through it. And so even these small moments that could have been life transformative at different times could turn into something a lot different, but they didn't acknowledge it. Whereas, you know, nowadays they're a little more attuned to it, maybe a little too attuned to some of it, but the reality is it's evident. Talk to us about emotional concussions.
Yeah, the reason I came up with that term was because so many people I would talk to would say, "Oh, I don't have any big traumas," and they see some of the people on our site, like Boston Marathon bombing survivors and Vegas shooting victims. They say, "I don't have anything like that." And so what I said is, maybe you have an emotional concussion. That's sometimes, even with the best of intentions, a parent or a teacher or a coach can say something to you in childhood that creates that emotional concussion. And I give examples of it. I had a lady who I had a great childhood, no problems, loving family. And so as I was taking her, I had her in a group actually. So I said, can you think about a time in your life where you felt a very emotional, you can still think about it and feel the emotion? And so she came up, she said, well, when I was 6 years old, I was in church with my family and I was talking. And she says, and my grandmother took out her hairbrush and I could see her eyes all filling up. And she says, and she hit me on the head with the hairbrush and said, stop talking, you're in church. And then the waterworks came, and it took her about 30 seconds to catch her breath. And what she said to me, she goes, I lost my voice that day. I just realized I never stand up for myself. I never, never defend myself. And she says, I never connected that. Now, was the grandmother trying to do that? Absolutely not. Right? So a 6-year-old hears stop talking and takes that literally. And so then she doesn't defend herself. She just takes and takes it and takes it. So it's just little things like that. And another gentleman, very successful guy, making about 2 million a year, trading options and stocks, derivatives. And he says, every time the fourth quarter comes, he says, my anxiety goes so through the roof. He says, I can't even go into the office. If I go in the office, my anxiety is so bad. He says, so I tell my partners, listen, I got to take a vacation. I take time off. I go golfing, anything to avoid going into the office. And he says, and I don't know why I'm doing that. I just know it gets bad. So we go back and I say, let's take a look at, earlier in your life, what did you experience? He's like, great childhood. My dad's my hero. He says he's my mentor. And he says he's the most resilient man I've ever met. I said, tell me about his resiliency. And he says, well, he went bankrupt 4 times. And so he says, so we would be flying in private jets. He says, and then in the middle of the night, move because we're being evicted. Then be back in private jets. What his mind was doing was protecting him from losing everything in the fourth quarter. So his anxiety was trying to protect him, not hurt him. And when people say to me, oh, this is what he said to me, I sabotaged myself in the fourth quarter. And what I said, well, it's actually impossible to sabotage yourself. That's not how our brains work, our minds work. They're protecting us. It looks like sabotage, but it's basically a protection. So what his mind was really doing is saying, we know what it looks like when we take too many risks. Fourth quarter may be too risky in the stock market, right? Pull out and sit back. He says, because January comes, he's back in full force.
These are, I mean, it's so normal and something that everybody feels. I mean, everybody has moments like that where they were transformational from childhood. You could just think back to little moments that stand out to you in childhood that probably were things that you would not want to repeat if you were doing it to your own kids. Yet we have done multiple things. I could have both of my sons on here right now. They could both create moments of emotional concussions that I caused them. I can guarantee it with 100% guarantee there. But
Yep. With the
eh,
best of intentions.
right.
So I just finished my last book and I called it Don't Mess with My DNA. because that's what I'm talking about. It affects the way a child's DNA is read and transcribed and will create changes in the DNA regulation, the genes that regulate the different systems in the body. And so understanding that, what I put in the book is it's all fixable. Nothing's permanent. So all you have to do is address what it is and then get to that and then get it resolved.
What so there are 2 ways that people can go through your program. They can do the online version. How big is the group? If you do it in a group, how big can the group be? Is there a limit?
There really isn't, but if the bigger the group, then I'd like to have other people with me in case somebody's struggling with a trauma. But
Okay.
generally 25 I can do fairly easily. The biggest I ever did was 140. I didn't know it was going to be 140, right? I got there and I went, "Oh, this is much bigger. I should have had somebody with me." And but people were coming up to me afterwards just saying, It's life changing what you just did. I now understood why my mother was like that or my father was like that. I never understood that before."
And it's best
So
live. It's best live in those big groups as well because then you're not sitting in front of the screen for an extended period of time. I mean, a Zoom is very difficult to do that over for 4 hours, right?
yeah, so Zoom, I wouldn't do it in groups. It'd be live in groups, or they do individual on the online program by themselves. That's fine.
Okay.
And they can do that at home or anytime they want to. But the good part of it for employers is they're providing a tool for their staff that they don't have to get involved. They don't have to know anything. It's really safe for the employee. They don't have to disclose anything. They don't have to go to HR and start talking about their issues. Because if they act up or do something that gets them in trouble at work, they don't want to look at a CEO. Does the CEO want to come in and tell HR, I've got an addiction issue? The board
No.
finds that out, they're fired.
Right.
So this is a safe way for them to go through it without them having to disclose it to HR or anybody internally.
And that now if they come to Orlando and go to your location, walk them through that. That's what I did. And, I think it's good. What is the process? How do they schedule it if they're interested in actually doing this?
So what they would do is schedule a time, they come in. When they get there, we do some assessments beforehand. We have them do our PEMF and a number of different modalities to we're trying to get them into a very relaxed, um, optimal brainwave state. Then they come in and sit with me for 4 hours. I take them through the program, and then they finish up by doing some more modalities. That's if it's a 1 day. Some people come in and do 2 days. And then we also work on how do you respond moving forward, right? And so our focus is the end. So the first 2 hours is science and education of the four. The third hour is some of the traumas. But again, nobody has to talk to me about it. I don't even need to know what the trauma is. So it's very, very safe. And then the fourth hour is on performance. And then you have audios that you continue to listen to that keeps reinforcing what you experienced.
And that's usually for 30 consecutive days, right?
30 days, but I have people been on them for years. They love listening to them. And we have a whole bunch of other audios in there. We have a mental fitness series. So I'll say, how resilient are you? What's your mental fitness and resilience? So think of it like physically fit, how fit are you? Mentally fit, how fit are you in terms of, so if resilience is something that you need to strengthen, then you listen to the resilience audios. If you optimism, you say, I'm not as optimistic as I'd like to be, so work on the optimism fitness. And so we got a series of those as well.
That's great. That is awesome. Don, I am a huge fan. I love what you're doing. I want to help get the word out. And I definitely encourage all of our listeners, if you or someone that you know is dealing with trauma, someone's child is dealing with trauma, Dr. Don Wood and his team do an amazing job. They've helped a lot of my friends, a lot of the people that I've recommended have had life-changing moments, and I have friends that recommended me to go see Dr. Don, and they've had life-changing moments. And so I think these are the kinds of things that you don't hear a lot about. And Don can tell you all the time about how life-changing it is, and you can read the stories. But I'm here telling you that I am a firm believer, an advocate, and I'm definitely going to be his hype man for a long time because I'm just glad to have him on the show. We had some time, and I wanted my team. I was like, we got to reach out to Dr. Don Wood. I got to have him on the show. We've been talking about it for like a year and a half now. So um, that's how I guess I procrastinated. So I still need to work a little.
You may have an emotional concussion somewhere.
I have a lot of them. I still need to work through them. And I think ultimately what I love about Dr. Don is that, you know, when you do go through a program like this, you can also re-go through it. You can reset, you can go through the program again. You have access to be able to learn and grow, and his team continues to help you through whatever it is that you're working through. And you know, I think it's a beautiful thing. It's also one other thing I want to say. There's a lot of people out there that have never talked to a therapist, that never believed in it, and I'm one of them. I have never talked to a therapist. I have never gone to any kind of psychiatrist or psychologist. It's never been my thing. Probably could have had some good work that could have been done years earlier, but I could tell you this. This feels like it's more of a performance coaching. It feels different than going in and wallowing in your challenges. Like, I've never wanted to stay in those moments. I want to find a solution. And that's what I feel like you're doing that makes it so different. And so I don't know if I encapsulated that as good as I should have, but I'm so proud of what you're doing, and I'm proud to call you a friend, and excited to watch your success.
Well, I really appreciate your friendship, and I feel the same way. Like, I love what you've done and what you've accomplished. You deserve all the success you have, right? You're a good man, good dad, right? Besides being a good entrepreneur. So I'm proud to have you as a friend as well, and as my hype man. I mean, it's perfect because you really are. You have referred a lot of people, and you speak so kindly about me as well. So I appreciate that.
So I'm going to continue to do it. Now tell people how to find you so they can actually execute on what we're talking. They've been listening this long. Now it's time to find you. How do they do it?
So if you go to our website, it's the Inspired Performance Institute. There's a lot of testimonials on there about people who have gone through the program that you may relate to. And then you'll be able to, once you get on the website, if you want to talk to somebody, you don't want to commit to it yet, you just want to be able to talk to somebody. What is this fit for me? They'll, or one of the advisors will talk you all the way through it and help you to see what's the best the best way to for you to do it. It could be online. Some people will do the online program and they get great results. Some may say, no, I really need face to face. I want to come in, and then we'll book you in.
That's amazing. Well, Dr. Don Wood, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to all the people that we can help change their lives just by listening to this show.
Beautiful. Well, thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate the time.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.